So all these concerns of isolating, of removing all the dependencies from that a component might have are usually referred to as isolating the component, right? That we want the component to be isolated from all its dependencies so that we can focus on testing its behavior and not confound its good or bad behavior as a side effect of other things that it might depend on. Now, the current implementation that we have for the user of UI components that we've been focusing on, whether it's summary or details of all the components that we've been looking at, are implemented in the following way. They are all typically they are stateful React components. Stateful in the sense that they are responsible for maintaining their own state. Okay, they have variables internally that they can remember. As you interact with them, either fetching or adding or removing or updating, the state is maintained by the component, right? And also it has event handlers internally that translate user interaction with a transition of the component from one state to the next state, right? All within the same state. It also has a dependency of services where the data lives, right? Where it uses AJAX over HTTP to go and fetch data from some RESTful service, and then it renders this content internally in the component. So this makes the testing of these components fairly complex. It's very easy. Hard. It's very challenging, right? Because we would have to, we would have to manipulate these events and cause the component to be in a particular state, dependent on some data that lives elsewhere. It just has way too many concerns, too many challenges, all within the same unit test. Right? So what we would like to be able to do here is identify what are the various concerns and divvy them up. Right? Just divide them so we can separate them. Right, and address each concern separately. Right. So one of the concerns of these components is that it needs to know what it needs to render. Right, and right now it knows the knowledge of what it's rendering is represented by some internal state. Represented by a local variable called this.state. Okay, so we need the data. So right now it's being maintained internally by the component. Now where the data comes from is from some remote service, right, that it's accessible through a network. So that's also something that we need to get a hold of fetching the data from somewhere. Right? How do we fetch it? That's some level of concern, right? So how do we deal with each one of these, right? So ideally, what we would like to be able to do is separate these concerns, right? And so the principle of understanding that these concerns should be treated separately is referred to as the separation of concern principle. It's a design principle that we should design our applications in such a way that we can address each concern separately, right? And they're not all tangled. Okay. For instance, some of these concerns might be so big that they might entail an entirely different set of skills. Right? So, for instance, there's the concern that these components are going to be viewed by human beings, right? And human beings like to see uniformity and things being having paddings and white spaces, and they like to see things pretty, yes. And that's a legitimate concern, and that has to be dealt with a dedicated set of skills, right? There's some folks that are really good at making things look pretty. Right, and there's a whole set of techniques and design principles, and people study this specifically, to do design. So we should design our applications to be able to separate those concerns, right? So we have all the CSS files that are separate from our files. We have these techniques of using less or SAS, and be able to compile these into programmatically and whatnot. So there's a whole world of dealing with that concern, yes? And there's also the concern of how do we fetch this data, right? And well, there's a whole set of concerns of that, right? Well, usually we encapsulate all that through some service layer that is responsible for mapping, some URL HTTP request to some, and there's all the design about controllers and web services and singletons. It's an entire set of concerns, right? How to deal with them and techniques around that. So we should try to address these separately, right? So for instance, one of the things that we're doing here is that we're going to try and simplify our components so that it doesn't have to deal with so many concerns, right? We're gonna leave it so that it only deals with a small set of concerns, right? For instance, we're going to strip it from a lot of its concerns, and we're only going to leave here the rendering part, right? It's only going to render. So instead of having to deal with its own state, we're going to delegate that to someone. We're going to say somebody's going to give you the data. Don't worry, right? We'll give you the data. Your only concern is to render this, right? You don't have to fetch it. You don't have to maintain the state. We're just going to give you the data. Your only concern is just to render it. State management itself is a huge concern. So much so that there's lots of libraries out there that seek to simplify managing the state. If anybody has done some Redux programming or has done some Flux or some other technique, you'll have played around with this idea, right? That state management is non-trivial. Okay, so again, we're going to strip the component from that responsibility. Obviously, it has to be somebody's responsibility, right? But what we'll do is that we're going to separate those concerns so that we can deal with the challenges of rendering separately from the challenges of state management. Yes. Okay. So we're gonna strip out the state. We're gonna put it in some other component. We're going to call it the container. The container is not going to be responsible for rendering. It's only going to be responsible for managing state. Right? It's also not going to be responsible for retrieving data. The data representation or retrieval will be responsibility of a service, and we'll see that in a minute. So we've stripped out state and event handling, and we're giving it to a container. Why does this render weird? There we go. So we've also stripped our component from the data access, right? So no longer is it going to have the responsibility of fetching data anywhere, right? It's going to be somebody else's responsibility. Okay. So the only thing we're going to leave here is rendering, and that's going to be its only responsibility. We're separating the concern. It's a common design principle. So now we're going to be able to implement it using another strategy. Instead of using stateful React components, instead we're going to be using very simple stateless React component. Right? It's and the idea is that the idea of being stateless is that they should behave just like a function. Right? A function has no state. Right? Whenever you call it, for the same input, you can expect it to always give you the same output. Right? If you add 2 plus 2, it will always be 4. Right? So it simplifies the testing of these components. Right? If you can represent them in a stateless fashion. Make sense? Right? So we're going to refactor a lot of the components to be stateless, and we're going to delegate state management and data access to a parent container. Okay. So this is going to allow us to create unit tests that can replace the services. Notice here that another thing here is that this React container is only going to have the responsibility of managing the state, of representing the state, of transitioning the state from one state to another based on certain events. Right? But it's not even going to be responsible for the services, right, of fetching the data. Instead, it's going to be designed in such a way that this service is going to be injected from outside. Okay, it's going to be going to be able to parameterize this service so that the React container is now going to be responsible, right, for the life cycle of that service. What that's going to allow us to do is going to allow us to create unit tests that is going to allow us to replace that service with a mock service. We're going to be able to intercept any accesses to the data set through a mock representation of that service. Also, the unit test is now going to be able to feed state into our stateless components, right, so that we can easily put our component in whatever initial state we want, so we can much easier compare what the actual rendering is compared to what the expected output will be. Right? So this we'll know that for the same state, we will always get the same rendering, right? Because the component will have no state. Make sense? So the idea here is to simplify the unit testing